Welcome back on the Pirate Monk Podcast, and it is such a privilege to have with us today one of the very earliest members of the Samson Society, a guy who was tagged with a nickname when he first showed up at a Samson Society retreat. I still remember Scott Dente saying, "You introduced yourself." You said, "I'm Scott." And Scott said, "No, I'm already here. I've got Scott. You're Scooch." And,
and proceeded to bequeath me with the honor of his junior high nickname.
Oh yes. Scott was along on that very first Samson Society road trip, the big one that went out to San Luis Obispo, where we met Aaron for the first time. And Scott and I traveled that following week up and down the Golden State, and have remained close, although not always geographically close, spiritually close ever since. So Scott Phillips, the musical artist, if you haven't heard of him, you will, or you should. And he's out doing some ministry this week. Where are you?
Well, right now I'm sitting on a rock in Houghton, New York. We're doing a teen camp for, it's put on by the Family Life Network, which is a network of radio stations here in southwestern New York, northwestern Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio. And they put on this teen camp every year called Summer Slam. And so we are the worship band. Me and my band, Good Little Giants, are here leading worship for the week.
Wow.
Summer Slam 2017. Good Little Giants.
It's epic.
Epic.
Yeah. Yeah. How many kids at the camp there, Scott?
I think they said around 140. It's actually a fairly small camp, but it's nice. Yeah. It's been really cool because it gives us the chance to get to know a good handful of them and spend some time with them throughout the week. So that makes it a lot of fun for us.
What, you guys actually interact with the kids at camp? I thought worship leaders at high school camps just kind of hover out there mysteriously.
Well, we don't have to. I don't know that there's an expectation to, but it always makes it a lot more fun when we can engage with the people for whom we are singing and leading. And so we played some can jam last night with some of them. We sit at lunch and dinner with them and just try to get to know as many as we can while we're here. So
about 3 episodes ago or so, I used, for all of our musical breaks, I used music off of your Good Little Giants album and put a link for it. But I think I started thinking then that I would love for our listeners to kind of go on the journey from the place that you were going around with Nate and playing music, and then your life hit an unexpected season, and then God brought you back all these years later to doing music ministry again. So how would you start explaining that journey?
Oh man, where do I start? My music has always been deeply personal to me, and so I writing for me is like giving birth, although I've never given actual birth, so I don't, no offense to the female listeners who have, but it's a laborious process for me, and so I've never been a real prolific writer. When I come to do an album, I usually have about 10 to 14 songs from which to choose and make an album, and a lot of writers will have 40 or 50, and they have to pare it down, but there's not a whole lot of pairing being done when I do an album. So my stuff, early on when I first started, it was, I guess I would call it, pretty melancholy and for some maybe a little depressing, but it was always really kind of subdued and emotional and just singer-songwriter acoustic stuff. And if you can kind of track my spiritual journey by looking at each of my albums and what I was trying for. There was an album where I was really trying to appeal to the CCM industry, the contemporary Christian music industry, and so I was trying to write, quote unquote radio hits, and that never landed, never worked for me. And so then the follow up to that was around the time I was being introduced to the Samson Society, and so Samson for me was a great introduction to this launch pad. It was like a launch pad for me to be able to learn how to confess in a safe place with other men who struggled with common things. And so as a result, I was kind of given some freedom and some permission to write that into my music. And so then came along another album, and that's the one when I was traveling with you, Nate. A lot of the songs from that album ended up, being the ones that I would share from stage when we were traveling, and they were all about, kind of my journey out of isolation and taking my shame and my secrets into the light, and just the kind of beginning steps to healing. That came from that. And so shortly after that, it's a really hard description, I guess, because I don't want to get too much into the details of it, but I was still struggling with a lot of anger and a lot of which led to depression, and wasn't taking responsibility in my marriage as the husband that I should have been. And as a result, my wife at the time decided she couldn't deal with it anymore. And so then we went through, around the same time we were going through foreclosure and bankruptcy, and that was around the flood of 2010 in the Nashville area. And our home was infested with mold from the water that came into it. And so then my wife and I separated and started this divorce process, which was kind of a lengthy thing. And so it was during that time that I started writing more songs. And a lot of my people, looking back on it, a lot of my friends kind of affectionately refer to that album as my divorce album. And that's actually, I took about a 3 or 4 year break during that whole time. And actually I told myself I wasn't going to do music alone anymore. Up until that point, I was an independent solo act, did all my own booking, management, website, fulfillment and writing and performing, and everything I did all on my own. And so I'd kind of made this promise to myself that I wasn't going to do that anymore. And so there's all sorts of stuff going on in the background that I haven't really talked much about. But
so tell me, at this point, around that time, you left the Franklin area.
I did, yes.
And that, that was a hard time. I remember a lot of those conversations. That was a heavy time, and you're leaving this, this group of people that you knew you had someone to call, and someone was going to be available, right? There was the safety in that.
Yeah, well, at times it felt like I was alone in it, to be honest with you. But at other times, it was. I don't know what was going through the heads and hearts of the other guys in our community, but there was a lot of there were a lot of couples and relationships intertwined there. And with any kind of a divorce or breakup like that, people on the other people who are in relationship with us inevitably feel like I would assume they have to decide, between who they're gonna stay in touch with, if either. And like I said, I don't know who who thought what, but for whatever reason, I fell out of touch with a lot of the guys in the group, and part of that was due to me leaving the area. When I saw how much child support was going to be, and at the time wasn't traveling as a musician. I was struggling trying to find work at Lowe's and as a waiter and wherever I could. It just wasn't, the numbers weren't adding up, and I made the very difficult decision to leave my 3 sons with their mom, and I went back to Pennsylvania where I was the only place at the time where I could find gainful employment. And so went back and did construction with my dad, which ended up being about 4 years that I did that. And so during that time, because I was gone, because of the geographical distance, I just lost touch with a lot of the guys. And so I kind of started a new community up north where I was living at the time, and kind of planted myself in my local church there. And it was at that time that I was approached by a guy who I didn't know at the time, but who was familiar with my music and was about 10 years behind me at the same high school, but we never crossed paths up until the point that he called me. And we got together, and he just wanted to see if I wanted to do some music together. And so we started doing some local things together, leading worship here and there. And I was kind of dipping my toes in it and a little bit skeptical about the idea of traveling again. And but we just kept being handed these opportunities, bigger and better opportunities, and we kind of added to the band a couple of new members, and ended up entering some contest, which we won. It was a national talent search, and that put us on the main stage of about 20 different festivals around the country during one summer in 2015. And so that kind of launched a new music venture for me.
So, but getting to that point, and this
right.
This is very familiar to some listeners and absolutely out of the range of even starting to fantasize about it for others, which is you're in a position to kind of start over. You had to start over, and yet you still had to carry so much baggage from the first, so it's not starting over. It's starting over with knowing I got to take care of my boys and do what I have to do. I have probably some wounds of leaving a community and feeling like, hey, why did people decide they could only be my wife's friend and it seemed like they couldn't be so all of that you're carrying with you. So where do you find the hope to say, okay, here I go. We can do this again. I can trust God again, and I can trust people again.
Yeah, that journey was a painful one. I mean, obviously there were all sorts of wounds being opened up around my divorce, and there was a time when I remember walking. I was going through some kind of counseling for anger and trying to get some, I don't know, some clarity about that, and seeing what role anger played in my life and in depression and things like that. And I came to the realization that behind my anger was a deeper rooted fear, and that was what was driving my anger. I was a major road rager. That's kind of where I would take things out, and I came to this realization that if fear is behind my anger, then every time I'm angry, I don't have to ask myself, what am I angry about? The better question is, what am I afraid of? And so I started to kind of practice that. When I found myself getting angry, I would stop and take a breath, which is uncommon for people who struggle with anger. And so God gave me the grace to actually stop and take these breaths and then ask the question, what am I afraid of? And that really helped to kind of diffuse the anger and helped me kind of start to think about where that was coming from. At the same time, I was learning to really retrain my thinking. I actually have a tattoo of Philippians 4:8. I have the list that Paul gives there. I have that on my arm because it was such a meaningful verse for me during that time. And that verse is whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are right or pure or lovely or admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think on these things. And I just remember, I was reading books about at the time about how we think and retraining our minds and taking our own thoughts captive and learning how to change that process, and what a huge difference that made in my life. I would wake up every morning, and I remember hearing a story, I don't even know where it came from, a story from Amy Grant, that she would wake up every morning, and before she put her feet on the ground, she would say, "This is the day the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it." And she'd say that 3 times before she even got out of bed. And so I started that practice, and that made an enormous difference just in kind of resetting my thoughts for the day. And then every morning before work, I would take a walk around the block where I was staying, and I would pick up trash around the block. And while I was doing that kind of small service for my community, I would pray, and I would pray specifically focusing on gratitude and what things I was thankful for, because at that point in my life, I had lost everything. I had built up this persona that Nate likes to talk about. I had built up this persona of a successful musician. And I had, as far as everyone else could tell, I had a good marriage. I had 3 kids. I lived in a nice house. We drove nice cars, and I had this kind of flourishing ministry, and all of that was taken away from me during that. We went through, like I said, foreclosure, bankruptcy, divorce. I lost access to my kids, and all of these things that I had built up as my identity were taken away from me. And I spent a lot of time taking walks by myself and crying out to God. I remember I had this one moment where, I had professed a faith in God pretty much all my life. I grew up in a Christian home, and so, Christianity is what I've always known. But I remember this moment thinking that, okay, let me collect my thoughts. You can cut this part out and then go back. I remember thinking that I had a choice to make. Either I was going to trust God, or I was going to get bitter and walk away from Him. And so, my choice at the time, at least intellectually, was to press in. And so, but without any control over anything in my life, I realized that in saying, "Okay, God, I'm going to give this to you," I realized what my thinking about God as a father was at that point in my life, and it was that He was indifferent and distant, and that by me giving over control and saying, "Okay, I have no other choice but to let you have this," I realized that I just didn't think He was gonna. He cared about whether where I ended up in His grand scheme of things. That he could take me or leave me, and that it really didn't make a difference. And that was kind of at the time, it seemed like a really profound moment for me, because I realized at that point that I could, like I said, either press in or walk away. And so my choice was to press in. And so I started opening up the Word more and trying to gain some understanding there. And he really started speaking to me about my identity and about it just giving me a better theological understanding in general. And so I would take these walks and pray and yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Aaron.
No, I was going to say that shift was so evident. You were definitely the melancholy poet in your earlier music, which I always liked. I like some melancholy guitar music, and certainly King David, before he was king, was an emo songwriter himself. So,
right.
But I remember when you sent me the link to your new project with your new band, and I got to listen to that. My first thought was, this is like some of the happiest, hopeful Scott Phillips music I've ever heard. Like this is a whole different thing. Just from the feel and the lyrics, it was that album's a lot about trusting God and that He's worthy of trust. So was that just the slow build into that, or was it like something finally just broke and you went, okay, you're not the indifferent father I thought you were?
Yeah, I think it was just the difference was me actually getting into the Word and understanding theology and letting that determine what my theology was, as opposed to just all the Bible stories I had grown up with and kind of what I thought the Bible said. Because up until that point, even though I had quote unquote ministry, I had never really spent much time in the Word on my own, and everything that I preached from stage was basically stuff that I had learned kind of by osmosis and growing up in the church. But as I look back over it, there wasn't a whole lot of theological depth to it. It was mostly just kind of feelings oriented and kind of romanticized Christianity.
That's rough for Christian musicians, isn't it? They're thrust on a stage. There's no expectation that they have studied or thought through or been educated in any of the things that they're now publicly representing. And often musicians are thrust up there very early without a lot of life experience. And so, what you described, I'm sure if we went back and talked to that, mid-20s Scott, he would be like, of course I know what I'm talking about. I'm not making this stuff up. But now you can look back and be like, oh my gosh, that guy didn't have a clue what he was talking about.
Yeah. Well, and and to be fair, nobody thrust me into it but myself. I mean, I was the one who entered the ministry with a bit of a cavalier attitude, and no sense of discipleship, no mentors, no one to really guide me. I did have a church that was supporting me just because I had shown talent as a songwriter. But yeah, I wasn't at all equipped to be in ministry for the first 10 or 12 years that I was doing it. Which, I know that God can use that despite me and my poor equipping. But yeah, going back to the albums, there's definitely a stark contrast between our latest album and the first one that our band put out. That first one was basically a collection of songs I had written over the last 4 or 5 years, and then the band got together and I had these songs and we put them down on the album, and it was a very, to use the same word, it was very melancholy, and there were a couple songs we tried to make a little happier, a couple love songs and things like that, but for the most part it was pretty heavy material. There was songs about my parents and songs about my divorce and just a lot of pain. I think that you could read from that. But then the album following that came a few years later, at least a few years of writing later, and yeah, there's a big difference. It's we were really trying to focus on pointing people toward Christ and pointing people toward hope, as opposed to just kind of commiserating in our brokenness and sin. So,
hey Scott, what's the difference? How's your experience differ between being a solo artist out there plugging away, doing it on your own, and now being part of a band? How's life different as part of a band?
Well, I for one, I love being in a band. I love having help, having people to play along with on stage, and there really is a brotherhood that comes along with that, and of course with brotherhood comes a lot of friction. And if we're not careful, the resentment can build and it blows up from time to time. But I love the guys who I travel with, and I love. We have a lot of fun together. We have a lot of fun stories together. So that element of it is great. Obviously, traveling alone, there was a lot of me being in different towns with completely anonymous, with nobody traveling with me, and if I wasn't careful, I could easily get into trouble.
Right.
Thankfully, during most of that, or a lot of that time, I had Sampson brothers who I could call, and so that was a big help. And then obviously you and I traveled together, and from time to time, even as a solo act, I would bring a second musician along with me. So there was that. But for the most part, I traveled alone and I was in isolation.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
So you were trying to raise money for this new album, I remember. Did you raise that money? Is it happening? Are you in the midst of recording it?
Well, that new album came out about a year ago. Year and a half ago now. So that was the one we were trying to raise money for. And
oh, really? That Kickstarter was for Arrows?
Yes. Yeah.
Ah, I saw that after Arrows, and I thought you were doing a new one. I was so excited.
No. I actually, Arrows came out. We didn't get it fully funded, but we had enough in our coffers to, fund it ourselves. And we did have some people give some donations, and so we funded that kind of both ways. But no, we don't have a new project in the works at this point. In fact, since February of gosh, when did we record that? I think we recorded it February 2015. Released it in the spring then of 2000. No, that would have been 2016. So since then, I've started writing 4 or 5 songs, but I haven't finished a single song in the last year and a half. I've been going through a real dry spell. So
Yeah.
Well, that is awesome. You're still just trekking around, touring, doing stuff like this. Is this your main what you're doing?
this is about half of what I'm doing.
Okay.
A while back, I maybe 2 years ago, actually an old Samson buddy connected me with a certification class to become a pipeline welding inspector. And that was a really providential thing. God put that in my life so that I could eventually get a job on the pipeline and raise enough money to move back toward my sons. And now I'm able to live just down the road from them.
Yes. Let's talk about that. The full circle. You moved back to the place that you had to leave so many years ago, reconnected in a whole new way with your kids and probably pieces of your old community. So what has that been like?
Bittersweet. It's like, the divorce and moving to Pennsylvania was like starting over, and then moving back to Tennessee was like starting over again.
Wow.
After 5 years of being out of touch with a lot of the Samson and New Adam guys, coming back into my ex-wife's home turf and where a lot of her friends and relatives live. It's been a difficult transition, but one of the things that God has taught me through this whole thing is how he builds virtue in us through the vehicle of suffering. And to see, and in fact, I would venture to say that that's the only way that he builds virtue in us is through suffering, and by because we don't learn patience when it's smooth sailing on the highway. We learn patience when we're stuck in traffic, and so if we expect to be conformed into the image of his Son, and for all those things to work out for good, like Paul told us, that Jesus came as a suffering servant. He came as someone who was acquainted with pain and hurt, and so to be conformed to that image, we're going to go through, as his followers, we're going to go through that kind of suffering, and maybe not the exact same kind. Maybe we won't shed blood, but that's how he's built virtue in me, and I've seen it. And so now looking back, I can believe James when he says to count it joy when we meet trials of various kinds, because we know that the testing of our faith produces steadfastness, and so I've seen the kind of endurance and perseverance that has built into me by going through these things, and even if they were self-inflicted, God uses it all. And so but going back to that question, the transition coming back, it's been a time of trial for me, but I've really focused on committing to a local church body, not bouncing around. Being in the Nashville area, I could go to a different church every week of the year, and still not even see them all. And so since I have come back, I've attended one church, and I've tried to commit to that body, and I'm really trying to kind of plant roots there and then bloom there where I'm planted. And so I'm slowly developing a new community of friends and brothers, and so there's a lot of beauty there, and there's a lot that I can see that's going to be coming from it, a lot of fruit.
So I think you've said it in different ways, but I'll let you summarize this to wrap it up. If one of our listeners is going through one of those restarts, whether it's because of divorce or death, or, there's so many ways that all of a sudden you're thrust into, oh my gosh, I thought my life was set and now I'm back to zero. And they don't yet see the light of hope ahead, just the darkness. What would you tell them?
Well, I would say you have the same choice, and to pray for God to give you the grace to press in to him. because James, later in that same chapter 1, he says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him." And so those who love him and remaining steadfast are tied together. And Jesus says that the one who remains till the end is going to be the one who's saved. And so read through the New Testament. Just bathe yourself in the Word. This is what I did, and I learned about Jesus is not looking for people to become nominally Christian and claim that salvation and walk around with it as a back pocket get out of jail free card. He's looking for overcomers. He's looking for people who are going to endure, and I want to be one of those people. I hope by His grace that I will be, and I want to see other people. That's my ministry now. That's what I preach from the stage is endurance, steadfastness, perseverance, rejoice in suffering, because God is using it. He's using it. We have these verses we love to cross stitch on our pillows. All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. But we forget that conforming to Christ that verse is referring to. If we're going to be conformed to the image of Christ, we're going to be sufferers. We're going to be co-sufferers with Him.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Scott Phillips, a.k.a. Scooch, thanks for hanging out with us there at your camp.
And
thanks for reminding me.
Hey, how are the listeners going to get Scott's music?
Well, you can Google Good Little Giants. We're on iTunes. We're on Rhapsody, which is I think now Napster, Spotify, all those streaming sites. I think you can find us on there. And our latest album is called Arrows.
Arrows, fantastic. And we can find a touring schedule there too. So,
goodlittlegiants.com. Yep.
Yeah. All right. Awesome.
Thank you, guys.
So good. It's so good to see your face.
Hey, man, Nate, you and I live about 3/4 of a mile away from each other, so we can see each other's faces again.
All right. Let's do it.
Let's get together.
Okay. I love you, man. It's good to see you.
Love you too, man.
All right. We'll be right back on the Pirate Monk Podcast.
There is a man in me who is already free, but I'm just waiting for him and I to meet. He's who I'm meant to be, but I'm